Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Barrett, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you through the generosity of Heritage Ohio supporters. We invite you to join us by visiting heritageohio.org and clicking the link to join. Heritage Ohio's mission is helping people to save the places that matter, build community, live better. Today, we will have a presentation on how redlining has shaped our cities and increased the racial divide in America. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time. Any issues with the webinar software are usually solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Later today, we will send out a link to the recording of this webinar. A copy of the presentation PowerPoint is posted in the handout box. This presentation has one HSW AIA Learning Unit credit. The learning objectives will be posted in the chat box here in a moment, as well as a link for any architects needing those credits. Click on that link and it'll take you to a form to fill out. We will also have a book giveaway, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. 2 copies will be given away. Again, I will post that near the end of the presentation in the chat box. You click on the link to enter the contest. Winners will be notified later this afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce you to today's presenters, Beth Johnson and Sean Suder. Beth Johnson is Cincinnati's urban conservator since 2016. She's a leader in historic preservation planning in Southwest Ohio and Kentucky. Sean Suder received his Bachelor of Urban and Environmental Planning from the University of Virginia School of Architecture and his Juris Doctor from the University of Virginia School of Law. He served nearly 4 years as the City of Cincinnati's chief land use attorney, became a partner in a top commercial real estate and land use practice, before forming his own law firm, which provides quality commercial real estate, zoning, land use, and public law counsel, extending beyond Ohio to Indiana, Kentucky, and Washington, D.C., where he is licensed to practice. With that, I will turn the controls over to Beth.
Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to have this presentation with Sean, and I know both Sean and I feel that this is a very important topic, that we understand how it's affected our cities and continues to affect how our cities are shaped today. So there's a little bit of a lag. So I'm just waiting till it goes forward.
Hit it one more time, maybe.
There we go. Hopefully it stays. Okay. Prior to the 1920s, the United States had a purely private mortgage system in which the government played only a negligible part. The system failed the vast majority of Americans, as mortgages were extremely limited and hugely expensive and only available to the wealthiest homebuyers. Residential mortgages prior to the 1930s had many of the same features as the unregulated subprime mortgages of the 2000s. They were short-term, carried a variable rate of interest, and featured bullet payments of principal at term. These loans also required high down payments, often more than 50%, and despite their high lender-friendly features, had interest rates that were extraordinarily costly by today's standards. Because home mortgages were scarce, expensive, high risk, and effectively limited to a narrow band of the wealthiest Americans, home ownership was far less attainable than it is today. Between 1921 and 1929, the nominal volume of non-farm residential mortgage debt tripled, and inflation-adjusted debt grew faster than in any decade before or since. The rapid expansions financed a home building boom and an increase in the rate of home ownership from 41 to 46% happened. Nominal mortgage debt started to contract abruptly in the 1930s, but remained constant in inflation-adjusted terms over the next decade, and the visible manifestations of a mortgage crisis unfolded. This included record levels of foreclosures, widespread distress among mortgage lenders, a collapse and weak recovery in home building, large decrease in home values, and a reversal of the gains in home ownership made in the 1920s. In response to this foreclosure crisis and collapse of the construction industry, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created. This federal agency was created in 1933 to serve as both a bad mortgage bank by buying distressed mortgages from private lenders and as a loan modification program by refinancing the mortgages into purchases with long-term, high-leverage, amortized loans similar to what we are familiar with today. In conjunction with Holk, in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established to provide insurance for loans to homeowners. The FHA's strict lending standards contained in the FHA underwriting handbook determined which kinds of properties it would approve mortgages for. In addition to physical quality standards, the FHA based its decisions on the location and racial and ethnic composition of neighborhoods where the properties existed. A large part of this decision-making process was created in 1935 when the Homeowners Loans Corporation began producing maps of virtually every major city upon request of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. Neighborhoods were color-coded based on the desirability from the gradings A, which is the first grade, to D, which is the fourth grade. Most often, D rankings were Black communities or other communities of minorities. The maps were used by both public and private banks and loan offices to directly discriminate and refuse loans to residents of the D neighborhoods. A ranking neighborhoods were affluent white suburbs, and the D rankings were always colored as red, and this is where the term redlining comes from. On your screen is an example of a survey form that they created for the area descriptions. With Holk and FHA providing billions of dollars to prop up a sizable portion of the economy, they felt compelled to appraise the stability of the neighborhoods in which they were making such substantial investments. So the first step was doing these area description surveys for neighborhoods and areas. One of the main deciding factors on the grade and rating of an area received was based on the inhabitants portion of the survey, and specifically section D and E, which specified where African Americans were present and their percentage, as well as what populations were infiltrating the neighborhood. The next step was taking these area descriptions and creating these security maps. The security maps were used by the public and private banks and loan offices to directly discriminate and refuse loans to residents in the D redlined neighborhoods. These areas were not able to be backed by FHA mortgages. So looking at the different ratings, green areas represented the in-demand, up-and-coming neighborhoods where professionals lived. These neighborhoods were explicitly homogeneous, lacking a single foreigner or Negro. The blues were still desirable. These neighborhoods had reached their peak, but were thought to be stable due to their low risk of infiltration by non-white groups. The yellow were definitely declining, and these areas usually bordered Black neighborhoods. They were considered risky due to the threat of infiltration of foreign-born Negro or lower grade populations. And then the red were considered hazardous, where there was heavy infiltration that had already occurred, and these neighborhoods almost always were populated by Black residents and were described by Holk as having an undesirable population and were ineligible for FHA backing. On the screen is a 1940 map of Dayton, Ohio, and you can see the different ratings there. And just as kind of a note, I pulled two of probably Dayton's most famous residents in their homes. So there's the Paul Laurence Dunbar. Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African-American poet and someone that was very popular in the literature community. And his house that he bought in the early 1900s is in that redlined neighborhood. So he would have been ineligible, even though he was able to purchase the home in the early 1900s, he was ineligible, he would have been ineligible for mortgages backed by the FHA. In the green portion towards the south, this is a neighborhood known as Oakwood, and that is where the Wright brothers established their house in 1914, known as Hawthorne Hill. So you can see that while both of these men, or all three of these men, were very famous and very well known in their respective fields, their homes would have been treated very, very differently. And then I also want to actually go to the website where I found this map. So this is the maps that you can pull up, and you can pull them up for various cities throughout the United States. And they're clickable, and so you can click on them. And so we'll go to where Paul Lawrence Dunbar was. And so this is considered a low red. And so you can see that where the inhabitants, that number 5, that section that has where the infiltration of what populations were. Relief families are families that were given relief through Depression era income subsidies, the type of foreign borns, what population were Black, what type of workers were there, what the income was, and they actually have favorable and detrimental influences. So if we go just south, which was a larger redlined area, you can see in here that, you know, the infiltration is with Black people. The relief is that there's 80% of people in relief. Estimated income's only $700. Where if you then go to where the Wright brothers were, you can see that all of those are basically none, and the income is quite substantially different. And then one thing to know is the C, which is that kind of the level 3 rating. One thing that I found interesting is that in the detrimental influences, that the major detrimental influence that was noted was that they had to travel through a Black neighborhood to get there. So this is, you know, federal policy, federal maps, and there's specifically written in racial influences into how things were dealt with. So as we can see, the housing policy through redlining was something that was federal policy. And then this redlining and segregation policies were fueled by other post-war federal policies aimed at encouraging home ownership and improved housing policy. The GI Bill, also formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, was a law that provided a range of benefits to returning World War II veterans. An important provision of this bill was the low interest, zero down payment home loans for servicemen with more favorable terms for new construction compared to existing homes. Then the Housing Act of 1949 had 2 specific elements that really supported redlining efforts. One was the federal financing for slum clearance programs associated with urban renewal, and then the increased authorization for FHA administration mortgage insurance. The urban renewal specifically had that the Act's urban redevelopment program actually destroyed more housing units than they created. And while today we often associated the term urban renewal and public housing high-rise developments with minorities, the original intent of the program resulted in minority-heavy slums being destroyed and replaced with more expensive housing or non-residential public works that were not accommodating to the original inhabitants. The slogan adopted by critics of these programs basically equated urban renewal with Negro removal. The effects of urban renewal displaced minorities and caused overcrowding in other minority Black neighborhoods, which in turn created more reasoning to grade a neighborhood as declining or hazardous and list it as a redlined neighborhood. It also created more reason for white families to want to leave neighborhoods if they were able to do so. So then comes the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This was enacted by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was the original authorization of $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway system. And then this leads to the expansion of the suburbs, which also therefore meant that redlining practices to newer areas was expanded and continued. With the GI Bill making thousands of families eligible for mortgages and the Highway Act making new areas easily accessible, the mass development of the suburbs began. However, as redlining practices established in the cities were still in practice in these areas, because most of these homes were funded through the GI Bill mortgages and the FHA-backed mortgages, they were almost exclusively white. In fact, the FHA manual demanded that the areas be maintained as a singular class race. It was written in the manual that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to the instability and decline in value. So these policies continued until 1968, when the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made discrimination during the process of selling a house illegal. Yet redlining was not effectively outlawed until 1977 with the Community Reinvestment Act. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 attempted to mitigate the impacts of discriminatory practices like redlining had on minority populations. It was signed by President Johnson as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, or familial status. Then there was the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, which helped create more transparency to help with consumer watchdogs to monitor the trends in mortgage borrowing and lending for compliance with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And then the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 specifically outlawed redlining. However, the question is, has redlining really ended? And so even though redlining was made illegal through these federal laws, it didn't mean the effects of the practices stopped. Schools are typically funded through property taxes, and as white flight took the investment of new housing and home ownership to the suburbs, so did the tax base to support inner city minority schools. This tax base, which was often needed for public transportation projects, was also diverted to the suburbs, leaving failing systems and infrastructure in the inner cities. Due to the lack of home ownership afforded to the Black population, they were not able to build up wealth over the years, and even if they were able to own homes, the increase in value of their properties increased at a slower or lower rate than the white families. This lack of economic capital created disinvestment or lack of desire for market-driven industries, such as healthcare and groceries or other economic opportunities such as small business home ownership to locate within the neighborhoods. All of these supported a cycle of disinvestment into the minority and Black neighborhoods, which continued to create a decline in property values, which has eventually led to an environment where the residents of inner city traditionally minority communities have low home ownership and therefore low agency for property decisions within a neighborhood. This then allows for properties to be sold to new investors and existing populations to be displaced. The following two slides are graphs showing the continued effects of redlining within Black populations and within property values. So this first slide is of the neighborhoods with Black populations. And so it goes from before redlining was established as federal policy up through current times, showing that the neighborhoods that were Black have continued to have an increase of Black population, therefore creating an even segregated environment. Even after redlining supposedly ended in the late 1960s, you can see that the percentage of neighborhoods of the Black population continue to expand, creating a more segregated environment. And then home values in redlined neighborhoods have remained lower than the neighborhoods classified as A or B, and have also increased at a lower rate than the neighborhoods classified as A, which were the green neighborhoods listed with green. And I think it's important to also realize that the discrimination established in redlining was not formed in a vacuum, that the policy of Blacks and African-born people in the United States have always been of a less than. Since the boats landed in 1916 with the first enslaved people, there has been an established law and policy preventing and creating obstacles for people of color to advance in society. And so before I hand the rest of the presentation over to Sean, just as redlining is just a part of the history of racial segregation and injustice towards our Black and minority populations, it's also just part of the puzzle of policies that have created and continue to create racial segregation and opportunity isolation. This webinar isn't nearly long enough to capture all of the policy that has supported racial segregation. I touched on how the federal highway policies and urban renewal aided in the furthering of redlining, but there were and continues to be zoning and land use practices in effect that support segregation. And there's also historically things such as covenants and deed restrictions that specifically excluded Blacks from owning properties. And while today those are illegal, there still continues to be practices similar to those that are exclusionary. So I will, so thank you. And I will now hand it over to Sean.
Well, thank you, Beth, very much. Great presentation. Learned a lot there. And I had a former colleague who used to say, I believe in coincidences, I've just never seen one. None of this is coincidental. And I'm going to show my screen here. None of this is coincidental. And I believe that it is all part of planned segregation, as I call it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Let me make sure I can get, okay. And can you see that? Okay. Well, very good. Well, thank you, Beth, for inviting me to co-present with you today. Much appreciated. Beth is a fantastic urban conservator. If you haven't worked with her, she really is passionate about what she does and a great asset to the city of Cincinnati and the region. And Beth, thank you for your service to all of us. Also want to thank Heritage Ohio, great organization, for allowing me to present on this really important topic. We need to continue to shine light on this history, as it isn't ancient history. It's really one, maybe two generations removed, but it really has impacts on a daily basis to this very day. I do want to acknowledge before I start, I think it's important to acknowledge when presenting on issues of race that I am white, and speaking on topics that do not directly impact me is worth acknowledging. But I do believe that as a resident of Ohio and Cincinnati, business owner here as well, these issues have and do indirectly impact me and my family. And I believe they contribute adversely to the quality of life for all citizens and society as a whole. So what gives me any credibility to discuss these issues? Well, I am an urban planner and a lawyer who I've worked in the public and private sectors on all issues of land use and zoning, seen it from all sides, and I'm a student of zoning history and zoning. And at my firm, we've developed an equitable zoning initiative, and we've brought together a group of national experts on inequitable and unjust zoning to consult with us in the development of an equitable zoning audit for communities. And so it is something I'm passionate about. There are many more people with much more knowledge about these issues than me, but I am fascinated with this, and it is a guiding part of what we do professionally. So with that, we'll get into the presentations. You know, Beth talked a lot about de jure segregation. That is pretty blatant, obvious. These are policies, written rules, things like that. Redlining was certainly a government mandated de jure segregation. There's really no argument about that. It was mandated as part of federal lending practices, which trickled into the private sector as well. But sometimes it is what isn't said that matters even more. And as powerful as de jure segregation, things like redlining were, racially coded planning, zoning, and policymaking were just as powerful in creating segregated cities. And that's what I'm going to go through with you today, a real world example of the Cincinnati Basin. And you can see a picture. The pictures I'm going to show you are all matter of public record. These are photographs that were taken by the city of Cincinnati and then donated to the Cincinnati Museum Center and the Cincinnati Historical Society. So all of these are available online, and you can pretty much see online a picture of every single building that was demolished as part of the Kenyon Bar project, which was an urban renewal, quote unquote, slum clearance project. The pictures are just absolutely jarring and fascinating to look at. They give a really interesting snapshot into what life was like in this urban neighborhood in the 1950s. Each one is coded there with a date There's usually a white city planner or intern or someone holding a sign for the photograph. And then, as you can see in this photograph, neighborhood children, mostly African American, who jump in the picture unknowing what is about to happen to their neighborhood, or potentially, most likely, not knowing. The children probably don't know, the adults may. But anyway, a little bit editorializing, but based on the work we've done with equitable zoning and the work we've done with our advisory committee, it's clear to me that we cannot heal the wounds or remedy the effects of urban renewal unless and until we, one, acknowledge it. And I think this is happening more and more as books like Richard Rothstein's Color of Law comes out and becomes part of more of the mainstream discourse. Acknowledge it, not just acknowledge it, but recognize it. And I think there's a distinction there. We can acknowledge the history, but I think recognizing it to the people that it happened to, and saying we are recognizing what we did to you and apologizing for it, and then actually doing something to remedy it. I think all of these things are necessary for society to heal from this. And Richard Rothstein in The Color of Law says, quote, "Undoing the effects of de jure segregation will be incomparably difficult. To make a start, we will first have to contemplate what we have collectively done, and on behalf of our government, accept responsibility." And I'm not sure that has happened. This is my own conclusion. We can never again see people or their homes or their neighborhoods or their lives as being, quote, in the way of economic or social progress. As you look through the planning that was occurring during this time, that was a common theme. We have to move these people out of the way of progress. This is not something that's only talked about in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. We talk about the same thing today in a lot of our development projects. We have to make way, pave the way for progress. Well, I don't think that's appropriate, and I don't think we should be looking at people's lives in that manner. Cincinnati had a more subtle approach than some other cities. A lot of northern cities took a more subtle approach. Some of the southern cities, Atlanta and some other cities in the mid-Atlantic, Baltimore, for example, around the early 1900s, actually passed zoning ordinances that limited where certain groups of people, mainly African Americans, could live and could not. Well, that ultimately both fell out of favor politically, but also fell out of favor in the courts. And so many other communities never used that express language, or never just simply outlawed certain people from living. They were much more subtle, and that's what I consider planned segregation, and the result of planned segregation being Kenyon Bar. So I'm going to take you through some slides now. I think this is really interesting. So what I wanted to do after I read Color of Law was I wanted to see how it all played out in my own community of Cincinnati. And I'm lucky to have a couple historic copies, the official plan of the city of Cincinnati from 1925 and the Metropolitan Master Plan of Cincinnati from 1948. And I read through them in light of reading Richard Rothstein's book, and found some really fascinating passages that really tell the story. And I think anytime a plan is written, and a lot of us on this call are planners, anytime we write a plan, I think you always have to, and when you review a plan, I should say, you always have to ask, one, who wrote it? Two, who influenced it? Who had a seat at the table? And three, who was it written for? And I think if you ask yourself those questions as you read through this, it's very obvious there were many people who were left out from the conversation. It was not written for people without a seat at the table. And the people who wrote it certainly were not people living in the basin. So I pulled out a lot of these quotes. I wanted you to see them directly from the text itself rather than me just reproducing them on the screen. But the first quote I took is from 1925 Master Plan, and it really gives insight into how people viewed zoning. And if you can see in the last sentence there, it talks about how the wealthy man could buy up surrounding property to protect himself, not saying what he's protecting himself from, or he could pay a fancy price for a plot in a highly restricted private development. However, only a limited few could afford to do this. For everyone else, every citizen had a right to quote unquote protection. Zoning offered the only accepted solution to the problem. So this really tells you from the 1925 master plan, which by the way was the first master plan of a city the size of Cincinnati or larger, the first adopted master plan. It's been, you know, Cincinnati City Hall is actually an American Planning Association planning landmark because of this. But you can see that this plan, which was written by actually the Technical Advisory Company of New York, Corporation of New York City. Anyway, they saw zoning as an acceptable solution to the problem being that certain places and certain peoples were not evidently compatible with others. We had a housing problem in this time. There was a significant housing shortage in the 1920s for various reasons, but one of the things I found interesting was this passage about the Housing Betterment League of Cincinnati, which was a group of people who were interested in working towards eliminating tenement housing and making conditions better, supposedly. But there's some passages in here that are interesting in this 1925 plan, and it really talks about the migration of African-American people. They call them colored population, but African-American people into the city really is part of the Great Migration in the 1920s. And it says here, which I find to be really sad, it says that the number of African-American people are increasing in the city, quote, while the number of houses in which they may live is remaining stationary. So if you read the Richard Rothstein book, you know that, or just any other history of the time, you know that there were a lot of places where African-American people just simply couldn't live, either due to covenants, zoning, or whatnot. So you see that written right here in this plan. It says, look, there are certain places that African-Americans cannot live, but the number's increasing. And then there are these places, in addition to the west end of the basin, where the majority of African-American people live, some 5 or 6 settlements. But then it talks about unsanitary tenements occupied by African-American people, where they often live 6, 7, 8, and even 12 people in a single room. And this is a fascinating line. I think this sets the stage for what happened in urban renewal. It says these slum conditions could be much improved if the city had available, even normal means for their control. I'm assuming that means slum clearance, but it's unclear. Another passage in that same plan talks about how it's not economically feasible to relieve these housing shortages by building single-family houses. They simply don't pencil out according to this plan. And it says that it's not the answer for everyone. It then talks about the distribution of housing of different types in the city, and I found this passage to be, in particular, particularly interesting. It talks about the housing in Cincinnati being, divided into either low-rent old tenements, new higher-class apartment houses, lower-cost 1- and 2-family houses, or new 2-family houses, and then best 1-family houses. As you read through a lot of these plans and a lot of these documents from the day, they talk a lot about better and best. These are terms that are used, even the federal government adopted terms like that, better homes, to try to indicate that certain housing was not tenement housing. It says, look, the old tenement housing is mostly in the basin, is gradually disappearing with the invasion of industry and business. It is not economical to reproduce this type today. In fact, the more objectionable features of it cannot be reproduced, thanks to the zoning ordinance and building code. You can see the idea of the zoning ordinance protecting against tenement housing. This is widely accepted in the planning world at this time. It goes on to talk about high cost and beautiful housing in Grandin Road and Hyde Park and Clifton and parts of Avondale and Westwood. If you're familiar with Cincinnati, those are all neighborhoods that are still to this day very, high value, predominantly white neighborhoods. It talks about all of this should be encouraged, although it is obvious from the history of other cities that the older developments near in will gradually give place to a more intensive development, and the best type of housing will gradually move farther out. I think this is a fascinating commentary here, essentially saying, as less desirable uses or less desirable people move out from the basin, they will eventually push the people in these desirable places out even further and further. And that's a theme you'll start seeing as you look through these plans. And this is just the statement, the penultimate statement here about the mindset. Page 53 of the plan says decentralization should be encouraged by every means. So what we had here was a dense urban core, a dense urban basin, and the planners who wrote the official plan of the city, 1925, called for decentralization by every means. Very powerful to look at the old planning and to see what they thought was the best kind of development. And that very same page, right below that statement, is Marymount, and the planners were touting that it was one of the best model towns in the country. And to this day, it is a National Historic Landmark. It is a beautiful neighborhood, but you have to know that Marymount was a segregated city that actually was segregated by restrictive covenant. There were many groups that were excluded, including African Americans, Catholics, and Jewish people. Okay, so Metropolitan Master Plan 1948, Canyon Bar Clearance, which was a huge urban renewal project, was the implementation of the 1948 Cincinnati Metropolitan Plan. Clear as day, really no argument. This plan in part is an urban renewal plan. It talks here about the older city. There's been a lag in modernization and improvement. Those parts of the city, those older sections of the city are essentially functionally obsolete. That's what that's saying here. It's been changes in the type of residence, gradual shift from owner to tenant occupancy, a conversion into smaller apartments, and it talks about mix of uses hastening the process of depreciation. They blame it on streets and highways taking on heavier traffic loads, causing congestion, noise, and danger to children. But essentially, what they're saying here is that the mix of uses, industry, business, all coming together really is what's to blame, along with the renters, essentially, in the basin. This is a fascinating map I found from the Housing Betterment League, Cincinnati. On the left is an analysis of the population that they put out, and it classifies blocks in the basin as either 100% white or more than 75, 50, 75, et cetera, and then those that are 100% African American. You can see as you get closer to the riverfront, where it floods off more often, frankly, or where it flooded more often, I should say, it became 100% African American. As you move further away, it became 100% white. These are some of the pictures that they posted. I found these in the Cincinnati Library archives of the conditions that they were fighting against, the tenement conditions in the basin. This is interesting. This is something they put in their slideshow as they were giving a presentation to try to get more money for homeowners. They were trying to get the building and loan associations to get more money, more support, so that they could get people out of these places. Now, whether that was going to be possible for everyone or not, no. The answer is no, it wasn't. But they were really trying to get other financial institutions to make more money available for home buyers, and they were fighting against the stream on that. This is also a statement of the Cincinnati Better Housing League, and I thought this was interesting, just kind of telling, there are 25 citizens, about 1,500 people in the general membership, and essentially they were dealing with an emergency shortage of housing. They were dealing with conditions, et cetera. But I thought this quote was interesting. We hold that slums are an anomaly in wealthy America, that they constitute one of our most serious social problems and are a vulnerable feature in our democratic civilization. And then it says, we believe that the problem of the slums is related to the danger of communism and other destructive doctrines. And this is really wrapped up in people's psyche, that these types of places, the basin of Cincinnati, the tenement housing, the quote unquote slums, were leading toward the destruction of democracy. And these are the kind of thing that gave political leaders the cover to effectuate the urban renewal plans. This is another piece of the 1948 master plan. It talks about a social and economic necessity to rehab and redevelop declining areas. It also talks about rehab and redevelopment as being one of the variety of treatments. It's an interesting term that they use in this plan. They call them treatments. And this is, well, I'll show you a map in a second here, but they also talk about the injurious mixing of uses that occurred before the zoning code. So they saw zoning as a way to separate undesirable uses, and they blamed a mix of uses on the destruction or the depreciation of certain parts of the city. Only recently, I can tell you, having been in planning and zoning now about 20 years, only recently now is mixed use development a thing that is acceptable in many places, and still in some places it's not. A lot of these things get into people's heads, and they remain there for generations. And this is just fascinating to me that they blame mixed use for these issues, even though we know now that mixed use actually is a better way to go. This is a fascinating map from the 1948 master plan of the entire metro. Residential areas needing quote unquote treatment. Again, treatment included clearing or demolition. And you can see that they identified the badly deteriorated class 1 areas right there in the urban basin around downtown Cincinnati. So over the Rhine, the West End, up in the Mill Creek Valley, all of that was determined to be badly deteriorated, that needed treatment. So they're setting the stage essentially for the Kenyon Bar tragedy. This talks about reinforcing a city of medium size. So this is kind of anti-crowding language, but it says that residents enjoy the economic and cultural advantages of metropolis while living in residential localities sufficiently set apart to satisfy the urge for intimacy in home surroundings. So they started also setting the stage for single family zoning, the idea that we needed to spread out, decentralize, and create and maintain a city of medium size relative to crowding. And then it goes on to talk about cost. And I found this to be fascinating because it says, where there are alternate choices, that route should be favored, which will remove from the tax duplicate the least amount of valuable property. That is fascinating. So in other words, remove the least valuable property and maintain the valuable property. Well, where's the least valuable property? It's in those areas in red. And again, we're setting the stage. We're planning for the complete obliteration of those areas. Nothing was safe in the West End. Even Crosley Field was demolished as part of the Interstate 75 Mill Creek Expressway development. That was the excuse for the elimination of the Kenyon Bar, or the elimination of the West End as part of the Kenyon Bar project. Today you can see this is in the West End. They actually have the home plate where it used to be in an alley, and they also have sort of a half-hearted attempt at recognizing what used to be there. And from reading history of the West End, the ballpark was a big deal for people who lived there, for many African-American people who not only didn't necessarily get to go, unfortunately, but they sold things around it. They sold parking spaces. They did all kinds of things. It was an important part of the neighborhood, the infrastructure of that area. Anyway, it's been reduced to that. This is what ultimately became a 400 acres of 19th century buildings. Once housed over 30,000 people. A total of 25,000 people were displaced in the 1950s. Their entire communities, neighborhoods, homes, businesses were also churches, synagogues were also torn down, schools. Their entire ecosystem, their neighborhood were leveled to the ground. And in its place was I-75 and a new industrial business park called Queensgate, which has very little density and is mostly warehouses and other industrial type development. You can see the difference here. This before picture I found versus an after picture. You can see the density, the unbelievable density in the West End prior to the 1950s. It was one of the most dense, it was one of the densest places in the country, and was 92% African American, mostly below the poverty line, but it was an incredible community, but also an incredible collection of historic buildings. And as you can see, it was completely annihilated in the 1950s and replaced by this. This is modern day Queensgate, modern day West End. This is the built environment. Nobody lives here. The population is 142 people as of 2010. 25,000 people were removed from this area and was replaced with this. No joke, this is Queensgate. You can see downtown Cincinnati out to the east. These are the kind of buildings that have replaced that incredible inventory of historic buildings, that incredible community that was there. And the people of the West End were given new housing in places like this. These are public housing facilities, still public housing facilities to this day. There was just an article by WCPO.com and Lucy May, I believe on Monday, that talks about the issues in these buildings, the conditions in these buildings that persist to this day, and questions what we're going to do about it. But you know, some of the ancestors, or some of, not even the ancestors, I shouldn't say that, it's only one generation removed. Some of the children and grandchildren of the people who were displaced are still living in the West End in these kinds of places. I thought this was interesting. I found this article. You know, there have been some half-hearted attempts at new urbanism, if you will, some putting some things back to try to bring parts of the West End back to life. And some of these developments, Hope 6 projects, et cetera, have you know, had some success, but they're a little bit contrived in my opinion. But anyway, I found this from Cincinnati Refined, and I thought this was a good way to end. He says, there's too much to say about the West End. Heck, there's more to say about the West End than there is about Over the Rhine. After all, Over the Rhine survived the last century intact. But beneath Liberty Street, the West End, formerly Kenyon Bar, wasn't so lucky. It was raised and paved over, all for the sake of, well, let's not get into that. It wasn't luck. this was planned. It was planned from 1925, it was planned again in 1948, and it was carried out in the 1950s. To this day, there is still, there are issues relative to development in the West End, and it is nowhere near the community it was back before the 1950s. And to say, let's not get into that is exactly the problem. We have to acknowledge it, we have to recognize it, and we have to get into it. And I want to give a shout out to Ann Delano Steiner, who's a historian at the University of Cincinnati, who put together the Finding Kenyon Bar exhibit. She got all these Sanborn maps and all these pictures, and she put together what is just a fabulous, fabulous exhibit. It's a traveling exhibit. We're hoping to keep it traveling. I know Ann's doing phenomenal work around these issues, but she got into it, and it's interesting that a lot of people from the neighborhood that lived there and were displaced as young children, or that are children and grandchildren, people in the neighborhood came back to these presentations and these exhibits and spoke about how wonderful, how rich their neighborhood was, even though it was economically poor. And it really started an interesting conversation that I hope we can continue. And with that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. We have a lot of questions and comments that have come in, and I'll start going through some of those. Jeff shared with us Paul Lawrence Dunbar and the Wright brothers were high school classmates.
Should I stop sharing? Sorry.
Crystal asks, have you heard of the straw buy? It's when someone else buys the house for another. Some blacks got their houses that way.
And actually, it's to note for those that have read the book, or those that don't, that have not read the book, I encourage you to read the Color of Law. And in there, they actually talk about how there were people that were able to obtain homes like that, but then the white people that bought the homes that were, then for their black friends or family or whatever, were actually often put in jail. There's a story from Louisville where that actually happened, where the white family that bought a home for a black family was actually put into jail for doing that.
Okay, thank you. What is the website where we can see the Kenyon Bar photos?
If you Google Kenyon Bar photographs, they will show up through the Cincinnati Museum Center. I don't have the website, but Google Cincinnati Museum Center or the Cincinnati Historical Society, and all of them are there. It's quite a powerful thing to look through them.
Next one, have you heard of the Senate considering a $10 billion for highway removal and fixing the African-American neighborhoods they tore down?
It's my understanding that there are a number of federal policies and programs that the Biden-Harris administration are interested in putting forth that would remedy some of these issues, especially relative to zoning. And essentially what the federal government would do is attach strings to federal funding for local communities on the basis that they would have to, act in a more just and equitable way, in whatever that is, whether it's housing, transportation, et cetera. So yes, I know it's that there is some hope for that. It's the Senate though, right? So who knows? But yes, I hope there's something comes out of that.
Next one, did the push for decentralization relate to pollution as in Cleveland?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the justifications for it, certainly. Cincinnati's basin was not it's not any kind of Shangri-La, right? I mean, it had flooded quite often. And some of the things in the plan are true facts. I mean, it had flooded. There were sometimes not indoor plumbing in a lot of these buildings. The conditions were not good in many of these places. So that is true. And pollution kind of hangs around in the Cincinnati basin because of the topography, because of the river valley. And so, yes, pollution was certainly one of the problems. We still, to this day, have environmental justice concerns with people who are living in the Mill Creek Valley. And a lot of those areas are low income and they are polluted. And so, yeah, that issue was present 100 years ago as it is today.
Okay, another one. Who are the primary owners of the tenements in the basin at the turn of the century? Mom and pop or larger types of REITs?
Beth, do you know that one?
I don't, and I guess I'm not familiar with the term was it RETIS?
REITs. I wasn't familiar with that firm either.
Real estate investment trust. They didn't exist back then.
So it would have been probably most likely mom and pops, or there was people that might have owned like 3 or 4, but you wouldn't have these large conglomeration of building owners like you do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly, I mean, that the tax code was different. The advantages of owning real estate was different back then. And there definitely were absentee landlords, though. I mean, the home ownership rate was low among African Americans. These were mostly primarily owned by whites. And but yeah, I mean, it wasn't like today where you might have a company who owns hundreds of these and then trades them as securities on Wall Street.
Okay, we have another comment from Myra that says, that's Brenda Brown with Ann Steinert. Brenda lives in the Emory Apartments. So that's some local Cincinnati lore there, maybe.
Very good.
Is there information if we would like to see Ann's presentation in our town?
So there is a Facebook page for the Finding Kenyon Bar exhibit. And if there's someone that's specifically interested in getting connected with Ann, you can reach out to either Sean or I. We both, you know, interact with Ann on a regular basis and can get you guys connected.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question from Jonathan. Know the political or physical reason the Hopkins, Clark, Chestnut, Central, John enclave survived south of Izard Charles?
Oh, Izard Charles Drive. I don't know, Beth. Do you know anything about that one?
I think that might be the one that's a part of the old housing that before it was all demolished with the new housing development there. So there is one that was from like an early housing federal housing project that was kept as part of the redevelopment of that West End housing redevelopment there. And that was actually part of the Section 106. Section 106 is part of the Historic Preservation Act, which requires that you take into account the effects that that federal dollars are having on historic properties above and underground, so buildings and archaeology. And so that was part of the mitigation for that, was because it was actually a National Register, well, still is a National Register historic district, and those were very early federal housing projects that had historic significance. So that was kept as part of that mitigation measure.
And one thing I learned through the Finding Kenyon Bar exhibit as part of Ann Steinert's research is that there was a promise, and this is not unique to Cincinnati, but there was a promise of better housing. So they tried to make it a democratic process. They literally tried to get the residents of the Kenyon Bar area to vote, to say, do you want to stay or do you want to go? And they dangled in front of them this beautiful new public housing that you can read a lot about in Richard Rustein's book. But that public housing, some of that I believe does remain to this day. But my understanding from Ann's research is that many folks did not get that housing. In fact, some of it, a good number of it went to white families. And so A lot of folks were on their own. And I believe, at least I've read and heard that the city handed out wheelbarrows to people in the tenements, and when it was time to go, they said, put your stuff in this wheelbarrow and go. And some of them made it into those beautiful housing projects, but there wasn't enough for 25,000 people. So many of them went into other substandard areas, substandard housing in other areas of town, in other areas that actually had environmental injustices. So it was kind of a diaspora for the urban African American community after this.
Jonathan elaborates here a little bit. It's a question about the surviving vintage 19th century houses in this enclave that survived the renewal. The Betts house is in this enclave of the pre-renewal built form.
That area. So that was a very early National Register Historic District. So I don't know the history of why, basically the entire area around it was leveled and demolished and redeveloped, but that was, even at the time of all that redevelopment, a National Register Historic District. So basically it was a lot harder to justify demolishing that with federal dollars.
Would be interesting. It would be interesting to know why that survived, that several block area versus everything else. But if you go through there, it's a fascinating little area, and you can just picture, if you look out to the west, that condition all the way out to Union Terminal. It's incredible to think of what was lost.
Jonathan says, got it, that explains path of least resistance, thanks. We have another comment from Kobe. Thank you for this very honest and very true conversation. As a public affairs person, I often work on issues related to the history and anxiety around these problems. It's refreshing to know that planners are beginning to have them. We have another one. Is there no redlining map of Cincinnati like the one you showed of Dayton because of the 1925 plan and 1948 master plan?
So there was on the website that I showed, and it's actually in I actually have the URL link in the PDF that's in the handout section. That actually did not have any for Cincinnati, and so I don't know the reason of that. It could very well be because of these early plans that they already had.
For Myra, thank you for sharing your insights and expertise and research with all of us today. And then we have Jonathan also made a comment similar to the West 3rd Street, west of downtown Dayton. The part that survived, I think, similar to the Cincinnati section.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Anything else someone would like to know while we have these great experts with us? John says, thank you. This was fascinating and upsetting. From Judith, note the significance of the route for the interstate and the earlier area destruction with the construction of Union Terminal. Certainly.
Yeah, there are a couple things on that, just real quick. This was a point in time before there were significant federal highway funds, and so communities had to either give money or land in exchange for their, the federal government's putting them on the highway system, the federal highway system. So, they did pick places that had the right topography as well. So the valley was the place topographically that made sense for that highway to go through, a north-south highway to go through. But coincidentally, I don't think, but conveniently for those who wanted to clean up, so to speak, the urban basin, it went right through the West End and the tenement housing there, some of the, quote unquote slums. So there are multiple factors in place as to why I-75 is where it is, but certainly one of the big ones is that the people that lived there really didn't have any political clout to stop it.
We have another comment. Thank you so much. When we know better, we can do better. Thank you, Joy. So architects, the link to register for the credits was in the chat box. If you didn't have a chat box, send me an email, jbarrett@heritageohio.org. I also posted the contest for the Color of Law book. Like I said, we'll close the contest in another half hour or so and announce those winners later today. Oh, here's another question. Has Cincinnati thought about creating a civil rights trail?
So I'll for the city of Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati, I don't believe has specifically thought about that. I know that there has been discussions with other community groups about maybe not necessarily a civil rights trail, but like I know CPA is actively working on trying to recognize and kind of discover the histories and recognize more of the African American sites. So I don't know if there's specifically civil rights trail. We do though, there is a statewide civil rights thematic study with the National Register in the Mance Hotel project, which has recently been completed over in Walnut Hills, was actually one of the first properties listed as part of that thematic study on the National Register.
Great. We have, okay, some people have asked again for the AIA credit. J Barrett, JBARRETT @heritageohio.org. We have some other questions. Could one of you briefly summarize this presentation just to grasp the main concepts?
That's a tough question.
So, let's see. So, well, actually, I think that the quote on the very first slide of the presentation actually does a really good kind of summary of it. That there is a legacy of past racial injustices that carry forward through time and affect the well-being of those living in the present. That there has been systemic racial segregation and injustices done through federal policy, whether it is housing, highway, zoning laws. So it's both at federal, state, and local level. There has been legal segregation that affects how our cities were created and continue to be created.
I have another question. Is this subject matter covered in Planning College?
So both Sean and I think you have I believe you have a leading degree too. So I actually undergraduate is in planning from Ball State University. In this subject, we did talk about this. It was definitely part of the history of planning and the history of planning law. But it was just kind of one of those, okay, so this happened. I think at the time we did not really talk about how it has segregated cities. It was just, well, yeah, segregation was part of it, but we did not really then pull it forward into how it continues to affect policy today.
Yeah, I agree with that. I did planning school in the 90s, and I grew up here in Cincinnati. I guess you would call me upper middle class upbringing. I don't know. And it's the first I had actually ever learned about urban renewal and Robert Moses. And that legacy was when I got to college and they made us read Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, which every planner, I think, on day one has had to have read in order to qualify to go to planning school. And I read that over the summer, and it just captivated my interest and definitely confirmed that I was in the right major. But yes, I mean, that if you've read Death and Life of Great American Cities, it's all about Jane Jacobs and how she fought Robert Moses and the principles she was fighting for. And a lot of these are the very same the same issues. But I agree with Beth that it was more of a history or sociological sort of discussion. It wasn't, there wasn't really a talk of how we remedy it, how we, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, how we recognize it, acknowledge it, apologize for it, and do something about it.
But I do think that is changing. I'm on the alumni board for Ball State's planning, and then interact a lot with UC's planning, and obviously the events of this last year have definitely affected them, and definitely affected, as it has everyone. And so I know that there's a lot of talk about how to include these topics within the curriculum, and how to understand what equitable planning means, and how to, in a way, repair the wrongs of the past that the planning profession has been a part of. So I do believe that it will be taught in a different way than probably Sean and I were taught it when we were in school.
Jonathan made a comment that he had it in school at University of Michigan, I assume is UM, at 2000 to 2002 in his experience. I have another question from Richard. What was the impact of the diaspora on the surrounding communities, such as Over the Rhine and Camp Washington?
I'll start with my understanding of it, and my understanding of it is based on really the Finding Kenyon Bar exhibit and some discussions and readings I did after that. But after attending those exhibitions, my understanding is that if you're familiar with Cincinnati, a lot of the displaced people from the basin ended up, I guess kind of going up the hills, if you will. So up the west side of town, Montana Avenue, Fairmount, up into Avondale, places that were traditionally a mix of races, if not predominantly white. And if you know anything about the history of the 60s, there were race riots, et cetera. There was a lot of tension, push and pull between people sort of jockeying for territories, if you will. And so I think the legacy, in my mind, this is just me speaking, I think that a lot of the racial divisiveness in this city, a lot of the economic disparity in this city has its origins in this Kenyon Bar. We're not even one generation removed from it. Many people have direct memories of growing up there. And frankly, I imagine that, that there's a lot of anger still in many communities about what was done to them. And so I think there are a lot of legacies, both social, economic, and of course, when you displace 25,000 people, they're going to, go wherever they can find housing. And so that obviously has impacts on neighborhoods.
And the evidence of the dysphoria in some of the neighborhoods, you can really see in some of the institution and religious buildings. So specifically in Avondale, there's a bunch of buildings that you look at them and you're like, that doesn't quite look like a church. And it was originally built as a synagogue, and then was transferred or changed into like an AME church or Baptist churches as the population changed from Avondale was originally heavily Jewish into more of the Black populations. And so there is evidence of that through some of those neighborhoods up on the hills as well.
I also had a comment from Monica Snow in Dayton. Preservation Dayton suggested a case study people might be interested in, revitalization without gentrification, Wright Dunbar Village, Dayton, Ohio. It's a workbook by Mary Omer and Karen Damasi, Sage Publishing, 2009. I put it in the question box. Jonathan wrote, I believe that the current leading generation of city planners are very different breed and knowledge base than the planners of 1920 to 1960. We're in the third, fourth generation of professions evolution and do know better. but most of us are simply advisory. We need actual politicians to know and do better in concert with our expertise.
I agree with Jonathan. I mean, urban planning as a profession really is a 20th century profession, and he's exactly right. I mean, these were very early planners. It's interesting, in the 1925 plan, I encourage you to pick these up if you can. They're at the library, these old plans, and I think City Hall has some copies in the planning department as well that you might be able to look at. But what's really interesting about the 1925 plan in particular is the planners used images and pictures from European cities to compare to things that they thought were best practices for Cincinnati, and in particular, European cities such as Paris, London, Budapest, Prague, places like that. And so that was what they were recommending that we do. By 1948, in that master plan, there were no such pictures like that. And so it's just kind of an interesting evolution that Jonathan brings up about urban planning. I agree. We're much more focused now on people than just the built environment. We're more focused on the intersection of people in the built environment as planners and the social and economic issues around that. So I agree.
John says the idea is still so often to raise everything and start anew. It just doesn't work. We agree. Yeah. Well, unless you have any other questions, folks, I appreciate Sean and Beth staying a little later here. The handout is attached. You're welcome to share that presentation with your friends. Also, you will be sent a copy of this presentation if you want to send that to anybody else that needs to learn a little bit more about it. Thank you so much. And next week we have a webinar that's also excellent called Preserving the Built Context, How the City of Milwaukee has Invested in Its Housing Stock. It also has one HSW AIA credit. If you want to register for that and haven't already, it's available at heritageohio.org. Go to our calendar tab. Thank you very much, and I'll have a very nice day.